Good morning.
Morning, morning.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Yes, all good. Thank you. So this is interesting because we're doing care conversations and we're both working in the same organisation. So, um, so obviously I'm Heledd. You know who I am. Cecily, would you like to talk a bit about yourself?
Thank you. Yes, well, thank you firstly very much for having me. For those that don't know, my name is Cecily Donoghue. I'm an employment solicitor and work alongside Heledd at GL Law. So I deal with all things people related, HR, employment, both from a business's perspective and individual perspective as well. It's not just hiring and firing, as I think a lot of people can be guilty of assuming. It's a lot more in between. Obviously, I'm going to be slightly biased, but clearly in my view, it's the best area of law and just practically it has the most impact on people. Everybody at some stage of their life will either be working or be a manager or be owning a business or different bits, so it can impact everybody at least at one point or more in their lifetime. And those red tape, the rights, the obligations that businesses owe individuals, the individuals and their duties to employers, it all creates an interesting environment where sometimes hopefully things go swimmingly, but sometimes, as I say, you might need an HR practitioner or an employment lawyer to give you some help and advice.
So I guess you're a bit like us in the sense that you do sort of planning work and you do crisis management.
We very much prefer to be brought in at the earlier stage, obviously, as you would too. That it's better to preempt and be forewarned and forearmed for issues. But yeah, sometimes it's the emergency crisis help. This has happened. What do I then do about it situation?
Yeah. So we've been talking quite a lot, obviously, as colleagues, about what's going on in the world of care and all that, and obviously, my goodness, is it in the news all the time? Care workers, NHS workers, social care workers, and we have to obviously, I think, talk about the last 2 years. Talk about COVID-19 and pandemic and. Talk me through that. Talk me through that from an employment law perspective. My goodness.
My goodness is a good place to start. Not only has it been incredibly difficult for everybody, and I know that seems such a sweeping statement, but I think it's important not to lose sight of how difficult it's been for everybody involved for the last 2 years. Incredibly difficult from the business's perspective, from staff, regardless of sector. If you just take this back to humanity dealing with a global pandemic, it's been incredibly difficult. But then you think about it, particularly for the healthcare sector and the industry in particular, have they really ever been more on the front line than they have been previously? Not only were NHS and healthcare workers looking after those that were sick with COVID or just otherwise sick, but they were also seeking to prevent others from becoming unwell. But then there were also those that were looking for ways to cure and combat the virus. And this is all alongside a sector that was not only facing huge demand before global pandemic, but there were existing pressures on waiting lists, times, treatment resources, etc., etc. So it really came at a front point where there was not only existing pressure, but in a sector that was just so integral for all of our survival and health and well-being at a point in time. It's been a very difficult 2 years, to say the least. I think particularly for the healthcare sector, both businesses and the staff that are working within it. We can't thank them enough. And I do think it's been a nice shift culturally that we now see them as our superheroes, as our saviors, as recognition of all the hard work and endeavor that they put in before, during, and post pandemic.
Yeah, because the word you use the word frontline, and we've heard that a lot. And it's that sort of battle mentality, isn't it? And I think we've all been there, and we've worked sort of throughout. Our sort of care colleagues worked throughout. So, what have you seen from your perspective as an employment lawyer with the sort of planning crisis, frontline?
Well, bizarrely it became quite. If I sort of take my human hat off and look at it just technically as a lawyer, it was some of the most exciting periods of change that we'd had. There was myself and my colleagues. Every Thursday or Friday evening, they would introduce a new form of furlough or changes to furlough or new changes on job retention scheme and different elements of it. And it was 7 o'clock, it seemed to be every, as I say, Thursday or Friday night, there'd be a new change that would come out, and clients would call you and say, so what do I do now? And it's like, well, we're getting this information as you are. So let's work through this. I mean, I remember, we were looking at working from home, I think the Thursday, and then they were announcing maybe a lockdown in London on the Sunday. And then obviously Boris, it came on, and the government announced a national lockdown from that Monday. And things don't just stop. And it's what staff were doing and how things were doing. And, some sectors did just close down. Construction sites stopped, the house viewings and sales couldn't go through. But then in the background, there was like, well, people are unwell and people need ongoing care, or people become unwell or need ongoing care. Well, how does that then happen when you can't go near anybody? So there were, just day-to-day issues, resourcing of PPE, how it was going to come in, how you're paying staff during this point in time, dealing with staff that then become unwell. And then I think as things progressed and we had, the initial very, very hard first lockdown, and then, we had a lovely summer, we had nice weather, we had easing of restrictions. People thought, we're coming out of this, excellent. And then the inevitable dip that happened afterwards. And I think that, the mental health pressure that put on, not just this sector, but all others, almost cancellation of Christmas just before, there were just a series of, in effect, bad news stories, crisis management, decisions that the government had to make, whether, you view that rightly or wrongly. And then we come into 2021 and another year of lockdowns easing, restrictions changing, different bits. And we're all dealing with change, personally, professionally, in this sector, how they're dealing with it. People that had operations postponed, then are they, when does that then come back around, and waiting lists and different pressures. And I think to use the overused word of unprecedented is, such a cliche, but it is the word for 2021 for a reason, and how it came in. And I think one of the positive factors, if I can use that term, that's come out of this is that actually I think we're a lot more resilient than we thought we were. Businesses did survive that thought they may not, even if they did have to make very tough decisions and make staff redundant. And actually change was a constant before that has then been put so much more on the pressure of everybody and the changes, lifestyle changes that we never expected would have to happen. And actually I think change is going to be the new normal, and it is about building in resilience to the business, to the workforce, to the sector, so that as and when things like this happen, and some of the scientists came out and said we were overdue a pandemic, we should have had one before, and the number of zombie apocalypse movies that have been made in different bits, it was all something that seemed like a sci-fi a show or movie. This may happen again. We may have different pandemics, we may have impact of other environment and economic factors that affect us. We're going to have to be able to respond to this and to deal with it, and as we're living and coming out of it, but other ones that are happening in future. So it's about future-proofing organisations and sectors to make sure that they aren't brought to their knees, that there are innovative ways that are going through. And I think sometimes that's a lot easier for other sectors. Healthcare is huge and so under-resourced, and they've got ongoing difficulties in any event, that it makes it quite hard to be so innovative or agile that maybe some other organisations and other sectors can be. But it's about doing what we can to input that now, just so that it's going to be easier for now, but also for later when the next thing comes, because unfortunately I think that's slightly inevitable.
Yeah, and you said something then. I think it is a lot of it in the needs. It's the mental health of people, isn't it? And we all of us have lived through the same period. We've all been in the pandemic, and we've all had our own crosses to bear, and etc. From an employment laws perspective, but obviously there's lots of things that employers need to be doing, and employees need to understand where the roles are. How do you see that sort of mental health has been much better, or has it been better integrated into the workplace? Are people better? Are they more sympathetic because of the pandemic and all that? I mean, what are you seeing?
I think we are. I think there are some positive steps and changes that have and continue to be made, but that's not to say that there isn't still a long way to go. We're seeing about mental health crisis in young people. They're coming into the workforce. We're dealing with such a multi-generational workforce that we haven't necessarily had to manage before. We've got people that are choosing not to retire and to work longer, and then there are people that are coming into the workforce at a younger age. So you might have 3 or 4 generations in a workforce that have their own mindsets, views, intergenerational or between generational considerations that an employer has previously not had to consider quite in such a way. I mean, businesses was when else has a business's input been more needed than the question, how was your weekend? was never that barbed before, and it was genuinely, what social life did people have, or what they've been up to, and just
Okay.
kind and human connection. But then the answer to what did you do for your weekend, if one member of staff had gone out or socialized, and another member of staff was maybe still concerned and hesitant about the choices they were making, that then had an impact on the workplace, which it may not have done before. And we're then looking at employers and businesses policing travel and where people could go on holiday, and the impact of holidays post holiday, then people returning. So it almost became that employers were drawn in and businesses were sort of dragged somewhat unwillingly, but unfortunately were required to deal much more with humans and our life as staff. So not only has the mental health impact just been huge as a result of the pandemic and the workforces and different bits that's been involved, it's a conversation that should have been on the agenda much higher, I think, much earlier. It is now firmly on the agenda and isn't going to go anywhere, which I think is fantastic, but it's making that work for everybody, and not necessarily wrapping businesses up in so much red tape that with health and safety obligations and what they have to do and how they have to do it, etc., etc. It's about making it work for everybody and creating that positive environment. And I'm really pleased to see that the maybe British assumptions and broad sweeping generalizations here, but we'll always say, hi, how are you? I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Yeah, fine, thanks. And that set script has changed. When people say, how are you, they mean, how are you? And that can engage in a conversation. So I do think there's been a shift within the workforce and peers talking to each other, but also businesses had to get more involved than they ever wanted to, and will still be required to a certain extent. And those conversations, I think, are where exciting progress and innovation can be made.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think and again, we're talking about all sectors, with employment stuff, and that obviously you've got people who are working in the NHS and being carers and being out there in hospitals, in care homes, going to people's homes to provide that sort of domiciliary care. But I think for those people, from an employment perspective, it's very much like we were all invited into other people's homes. You suddenly got this massive insight into like, oh, hello, what's that behind you? And I know there was a real sort of discussion at the sort of early doors going, well, it can be quite invasive, or people might feel quite difficult about it. But has it been a good thing? I mean, has it been a good thing that people have gone, actually, do you know what? Sorry, I've got to go and grab that because the doorbell's ringing, or oh, sorry, the cat's come in, and actually it's humanized us a bit more. I mean, I've certainly felt that with some of the work I've been doing, that I felt much more connected to people because I'm conscious that I'm sort of in their space a bit.
Yeah, and I think that goes two ways. I mean, you and I, as lawyers and solicitors, there can often be, assumptions or a very corporate perception to us. But you and I are human as well, and I think the work and the people we deal with is much more human based. And maybe I'm using the word human incorrectly, but it is about people and people helping people and people working with people. It may be even oversimplified. And I think, yes, it has made us all more aware and into each other's worlds. I mean, we're both at home at the moment. We're both being able to work remotely. The tech that has been able to facilitate that, I think, is fantastic. There is more we can do, and I'm the first one to say that sometimes it takes me a little longer to work my head around the tech than maybe some others, but I do think that can help to facilitate some of these easing of the difficulties and promote more positive mental health and ways that people are able to work. But I think it needs change and discussion on all sides, and I don't mean to make it sound quite so divisive. It's not sort of us employer and them workforce. It shouldn't be that. It should be a collegiate and sort of engaged process, consultation requirements aside and otherwise. And I do think the tech, the changes, that humanization of everybody, that has made those conversations easier to have, and hopefully will continue to be had.
Yeah, and I agree, because I was reading something sort of, and I said, actually, do you know what? It's a great leveler doing this on video, because you're talking to people from exactly the same space. So you're not judging them from, you don't see what's underneath the shoulders. And they that was a quite nice little infographic, and they had sort of different shapes and sizes and people in wheelchairs and they, they're like, actually it's been a bit of a leveler, because everybody's got the same opportunity to talk in the same way, without, and you don't have those sort of physical barriers of maybe tables. And as you say, we're lawyers, and people sort of think, oh, a bit scary going in, and and I felt when I have been seeing people in person, because of things like social distancing, I've not been able to be as quite as involved, which has been quite interesting. As you say, we're people, we're human lawyers, and we're lawyers that are also human. and you sort of sit there and go, oh, I want to sit around a table with you in not in a sort of, I'm terribly sorry, you're going to have to be very far away.
But
So
it is interesting as well. So on the flip side of that, I find that employer or employment related conversations can be so much more difficult remotely. Yes, it's a great leveler, but also how body language and tone and different intonation, which, I'm seeing you, I'm hearing you, there shouldn't be such a difference, but there is a very different environment to an online virtual way of communicating than in person. And I'm aware, I've helped businesses go through consultation processes, be them positive and negative, redundancy, consultation and changing terms and conditions or otherwise. And announcements, town hall meetings or group discussions would previously been held, in the office or wherever the workplace was, in a particular room, a meeting room, be it the canteen because it was the biggest room, etc., etc. And the boss would stand up and say what they needed to say, and then there would be engagement with stuff, and you could feel the room. There would be a vibe, different bits. Whereas now, I mean, we heard on in the news about big organizations that would have massive Zoom calls, and then it would just be somebody saying something, everybody on mute, then it would go away, and it has changed how we interact. And I think sometimes not necessarily for the better. I have seen employment discussions that have been held, for example, grievance hearings or disciplinary hearings, performance management, etc., that then are recorded on Zoom, just like we're doing today. But those are then subsequently disclosable in employment tribunal proceedings. And there's a big difference between maybe a cold piece of paper that were minutes of a meeting to hearing, seeing the body language through a video that a judge may not previously have been able to see. And I'll be honest, there have been some videos I've seen that are a little toe-curlingly embarrassing, and I do hope that we, just tactically, we had to discuss settlement more quickly, because if you can see that a manager is not listening, not engaged, looking around a room, tutting, sighing, crossed arms, that sort of, a tribunal was brought in to that meeting almost like a fly on the wall, whereas previously it would have been, attendees, question answer, maybe in a more minuted format. So it is really interesting how it goes through, and I'm sure the conversations were being held like that before, but now I can see them sometimes when I need to advise on that and see a video, and it does change the position. And would you want that recording to go before a judge to consider, the impact of it and different things? So it's helpful, but it also just means that there's more trip hazards in the way for both businesses and staff, and it's just, there's a lot to think about, as there has always been, but it's never increasing agenda for sure.
Gosh, I really hadn't, because really hadn't occurred to me that tech was being used in those circumstances. That is a real shift, isn't it? Because we've all had to learn to use the tech overnight. But yeah, to have that observation, as you say, that sort of that almost real time, this is how it panned out, rather than well, let's take time to reflect and write down the salient points. That's a real change, isn't it?
It's live, it's messy, it's people, and that's how it's always been, but not quite so recorded, virtual and taken forward. But I think there are ongoing positive signs. I mean, we were talking about the last 2 years, but sort of looking slightly more forward, we have at this point in time had some of the easing of restrictions. Now that has been met with fear, but also it's been welcomed by a lot of people and different bits and how they're going through, and that the approach has now significantly shifted to living with COVID and the plans that come in, and the public has been encouraged to take personal responsibility for their actions. I mean, I would argue that there's probably been an element of that throughout, but that's certainly the shift now in the communication. And from the 24th of February, the UK government ended any remaining legal COVID restrictions, particularly in England. And I know there's like differences in Wales and Scotland as they've been coming through. But whilst, as you say, depending on your viewpoint, whether that's positive or negative, that has had another impact on businesses, because it has almost pushed the decisions again back onto businesses and employers. So before, if you had a positive test or you had the symptoms, etc., they were very strict, albeit changing at all times, isolation rules and requirements and periods of time and different bits. Well, now they've gone, but a business's health and safety obligations haven't, and the virus hasn't gone away, either. So we've now got a sort of conflict sometimes that, yes, there's freedom in the easing of restrictions, and businesses can make their own decisions now about how they want to deal with, staff sickness and health and absence and different bits. But there's a big difference then between the sectors. So for just, and this is an oversimplification by very much so, but let's say an office environment, let's say a law firm, like ourselves, staff can and have proved that they can work very successfully remotely and from home. So if you're feeling under the weather, whether or not you've got COVID or otherwise, you can make a decision, or the business can make a decision, that if anybody's unwell or if anybody thinks they might have COVID, they should self-isolate. And that can be a requirement that the business can put in place, and it's a choice. It is easier because we can all work from home. So it's sort of seamless. I can, be in the office one day, realize I'm not feeling very well, I'm going to work from home. And that's fine. I can continue to provide the service. I can continue to do my job. I can continue to liaise with clients, and therefore I can continue to get paid. Yeah. Whereas with healthcare, and I appreciate in a lot of other sectors as well, but let's look particularly at healthcare, it is a person-to-person, service-orientated sector. So somebody can't just, in the NHS, a nurse can't just go and work from home. His or her patients aren't going to be there, and it's very much, you might be caring for somebody that has underlying health conditions or is otherwise unwell anyway, and you are mindful of your health and how that might impact on them. But it makes it much more difficult for NHS sectors and the trust and also those businesses working in care home or health and care provision to make similar decisions, because if those staff that are then unwell come in, they may make other members of staff unwell or their clients and patients unwell.
Domino effect then, isn't it?
But if they then send them home, they're already short-staffed, they're already struggling to fill and resource the capacity that they need anyway, bit increased because people are still unwell. And what's the position on pay, and how do we have the clarity? And testing isn't required anymore so much, but when do we? So it makes it almost messier, this transition, this easing of the restrictions. And businesses are working incredibly hard, and I recognize that they're doing a really good job of putting in place these bits of communicating it to staff. But if you're a business that decides that whilst it doesn't have to require staff to isolate, but you wish to do so, you are in effect suspending somebody when they are willing and able, and legally willing and able, to provide that work. So you can't just send somebody home and pay them SSP if they're not unwell and can work, and statutory sick pay or company sick pay if you have enhanced measures in place. You're going to have to think about paying them full pay, because you are effectively preventing them from working when they otherwise would be willing and able to do so. So as I say, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for everybody, but it is positive that we are learning to live with COVID.
Yeah.
But there are still ramifications from that, more so I think for the healthcare sector than with any others, that will continue to have to be dealt with.
Because of that, as you say, person to person sort of, as you say, we can dip in and out as appropriate, and I'm sure people will quite appreciate not coming down with COVID or colds or whatever. Because I think I'm quite interested as well, and to touch upon the point about the vaccines and the can't force people to have vaccines, of course not, but huge rollout of a program of vaccines, and first, second, third, for some people now going to have a fourth injection. Now of course that the vaccine was a bit controversial, wasn't it, in the care sector, and how were you seeing that sort of affecting employment issues? I mean, what a very difficult conversation just to have.
Yeah, I mean, let's stand back and look at this. Yes, pandemic, hugely shocking, hugely surprising, etc. But whenever has a government legislated on requiring staff to be vaccinated as a condition of employment? I mean, we come back to this overused, unprecedented term, but it was pretty shocking, as a concept. But at the same time, it also seemed to some eminently sensible, a logical next step, a obvious requirement, a safeguarding issue, a health and safety requirement. It was surprising, but also not surprising, because we've been through such a tumultuous and changeable time. I mean, there was the announcement that for care homes, it would be a requirement for staff and potentially those that were accessing the care home as working to be vaccinated as a condition of employment. It was announced. It was hugely controversial. There were challenges to it that were unsuccessful subsequently, and it came into effect in November, and it was a requirement at that point. And businesses had gone through that huge period of, you know, discussion, consultation, sitting down with staff, trying to understand, you know, what their position is, asking them about their vaccination status, which, you know, from a personal data perspective, opened up huge can of worms. You've got, you know, individuals' right to freedom of choice, because it wasn't a nationally imposed, everybody in the country or various parts had to be vaccinated. It was these specific workers in this specific sector for these specific requirements, different bits. And it was then, you know, implemented with, yes, a lead in a period of time, but when businesses were already still struggling with the day-to-day issues of the pandemic and going through. And I think, you know, they did hugely well to have that discussion, to get it all in place in time. And there was support provided in terms of the package of materials that could go through. But it was a huge, huge change brought into effect. And some businesses would have had to have dismissed staff as a result. So they're already short-staffed, and they're having to dismiss staff and then try and recruit from an already smaller pool from Brexit, et cetera, that then where were the staff and how are they vaccinated and different bits going through. So they did well to do that. Came in November. A similar time, there was the announcement that would then be extended to the wider health and social care from 1st of April this year. And then we had a bit of a sea change. I think it's a bit of an understatement. So we had the positioning care homes come in. It was enforced. They did the requirements, came in November, fine. There was then discussion sort of just before Christmas and again then late January about, do we still extend this to the wider social care? And actually, do we look at repealing this, not only for the April deadline, but actually for the care home deadline that was brought in? So on the 31st of January, there was an announcement by the government that said, look, you know, we've had the Omicron wave, or we're dealing still with the Omicron wave. And actually, you know, given the numbers, given where the virus is, actually, this is something we should be thinking about again. And they announced a change in policy to potentially consider revoking the care home legislation and abandoning the wider health and social care legislation that had been brought in, subject, of course, to consultation. Now, it was interesting, and sort of with my legal hat on, it was quite an interesting period of time. So the laws had come in. The laws were there to said that this is obviously for the care homes it had come in, but for the wider health and social care, as of the 1st of April, this had to happen. And then the government made this announcement that it might not need to happen. And everywhere in the press and different bits was all like, oh, cracking, you know, let's just relax. We don't need to do this anymore. It's like, well, the law is still there. So then you have, again, a very difficult position for the NHS in particular at that point in time, because they were obviously mid-consultation. And there were announcements by the NHS that said, you know, pause or don't dismiss, wait until the outcome, which was sensible. And we were advising clients similarly to do the same. But we were in this limbo of, well, we would have been consulting, we would have been ramping this up, we probably would have been dismissing staff during this period of time. We're now not doing that. But what's the outcome going to be? And we were, you know, herring through February and now into March, and April was coming ever swiftly. What was going to happen? So the government then opened the consultation a few weeks later, and it happened in early February for 1 week. And it was a consultation which seemed incredibly brief, but during that period of time, there was over 90,000 responses that were submitted. Now, there were two questions, and I won't go into the detail of the consultation particularly, but the overall outcome was that 90% of those that took part supported the revocation of these vaccination as a condition of employment regulations and the requirement. There were 9% that were opposed to it. So, you know, quite a clear landslide that there was overwhelming majority voting for the removal of these legislation requirements. Then it all went quiet for a little bit. And then on the 1st of March, the government announced that the regulations requiring vaccination of a condition of employment in CQC registered care homes would be lifted from the 15th of March. So at the time, obviously, we're recording this. This is the 11th of March today. So by next Tuesday, the regulations will be lifted. So from, I think it was the 11th of November to the 15th of March, it was a legislative requirement that all those that fell within the care home regulations have to be double vaccinated, you know, boosted, et cetera, et cetera. And then from the 15th of March, next week, that will be released.
I mean, that's just seismic, isn't it? Change.
But then not only just on, as you say, the CQC registered care homes, but the health and social care requirement to be double jabbed that was coming in on the 1st of April, that's now been removed. So hopefully, and I don't know, it'll be interesting to see when the statistics actually come out. But as I say, the care homes had to go through this. They had to sack people that did not meet this requirement, dismissal and going through. the social and wider health and social care that we're looking at it for the 1st of April deadline, they didn't get as far. It wasn't brought in upon them. There was time. It's been revoked before it was implemented. But I wonder how many staff were dismissed at the early stages that now will be rehirable and can be re-employed in different bits as it goes through. So both groups and all those, it's obviously still a government position that everybody remains strongly advised to be vaccinated, particularly so in these circumstances. But it's no longer compulsory, and it's no longer a condition of employment. So yeah, it was a busy end of winter, beginning of spring for all of these changes while still dealing with a pandemic. So just summarizing that sea change, it just feels like anybody else need a sit down at this point in time.
Some cold flannels, and I think as we were saying at the beginning, this is all about people. So these are people who, as you say, they had jobs and then they didn't have jobs, and now have they found other employment? Do they want to go back into that sector where perhaps they felt a bit unloved? Technical
or it's
term
the skill set that they had, and therefore that's they didn't want to retrain, or there wasn't the ability to retrain at that point in time, so they can go back into it. But I mean, how hard just on a one-to-one basis would that be? You worked for somewhere maybe for years and you had strong views about your vaccination status, which is your right to do so. You were then dismissed by somebody, and you're going to be hesitant to necessarily apply and go back to work. I would think. I don't know. It's just it's going to be individual choice here. But it's at a point in time where this sector was, struggling or facing adversity pre-pandemic and challenges, to then being on the front line, being so overwhelmed, dealing with the pandemic as it was in its movable and horrible faces that it presented. Then dealing with legislative and regulatory changes, you must have staff vaccinated, different, and then, oh, hang on, no, we thought about it, maybe we don't now, and then changing contestation, different bits. I mean, I'm not surprised there's mental health crisis, going on in different bits,
goodness,
the stresses and that comes through. And, actually, unfortunately, it didn't stop there. And if you don't mind me sort of leading in, there was another change that was introduced, which I think is slightly more positive, but a change nonetheless that health and social care employers will need to grapple with. But you may remember, obviously, with Brexit, and there were concerns about significant amount of migrant workforce and workers that made up the healthcare sector and the workers that were involved in it. And obviously there was consideration with the Brexit referendum, the votes, and then changing requirements, EU workers, settlement schemes, changing to the immigration scheme, etc., all lots of changes that then particularly impacted this sector, I think, as well at this point in time. And you may remember there was a health and care worker visa that was launched back in August 2020. So, middle of sort of pandemic and sunshine and different bits, and we didn't quite know what was around the corner again. But fundamentally, that allowed medical professionals to come or stay in the UK to work in the NHS, an NHS supplier, or adult social care. Now, they had to meet obviously quite a lot of eligibility criteria, and they had to have an employer that was sponsoring them, so a sponsor licensed employer. Now, that was fine, but that was at a particular level of pay, seniority, certain roles, the standard requirements that we see in immigration, and care workers were not necessarily included within that.
Right.
Very difficult. Now, there were lots of discussions and announcements and pressures to change this system, because otherwise there was going to be a huge gap potentially in this migrant workforce that made up so much of the health and social care sector. And there were sort of indications and sort of murmurings late December and early January in different bits. And then there's been an announcement that from the 15th of February, certain care roles were then added, particular care workers, and they were added to the shortage occupation list, and then extended that. So I don't want to get too much into the sort of detail and nuances, because I think sometimes that can lose the impact. But fundamentally, this type of visa can enable workers, and now potentially a wider group of care workers, to apply, come to the UK, work for a sponsored employer in a skilled worker route, and they can potentially stay for up to 5 years. And once they've reached 5 years, they can apply for settled status or options to extend it and stay. So it's a requirement to have a job that meets the criteria. So you must have a sponsored employer. The role must meet the requirements. And what is good with this health and care worker visa, particularly now with the latter changes that have been introduced this year, is that there's slightly lower formal qualification requirements, or there's reduction in the cost of the visa application process, or they're speeding up the processing times to do so. So there are sort of subtle differences. But if I can list, and sorry to sort of get slightly technical, but there are standard occupation classification codes that form part of these lists that are either the shortage occupation list or different bits of the skilled workers. And they added 6145 care workers and home carers to this particular list. And related job titles include care assistant, care worker, carer, home care assistant, home carer, support worker, brackets nursing home. So you can see how that really does change and include such a broader range of workers within this type of visa that previously just wouldn't have been eligible at all for any of the requirements. So that's really good. So by adding those particular roles to the shortage occupation list, applicants can benefit from lower salary requirements, which is good obviously for the employers, don't have to be offering such high rates of pay, and reduced visa application skills when comparing them to other skilled worker visas. Hopefully everyone's still with me at this point in time. So if you're then an employer and you're looking and you've got a crisis in your workforce and you've been short-staffed and you've been managing the pandemic and you've been managing sickness and isolation and et cetera, as it now goes forward, this may be a lifeline for you.
Yes.
You can have access now to a migrant workforce that you couldn't access for a period of time. But it's not quite that straightforward. And I don't mean to sound negative, but there are quite a lot of steps and hurdles to go through. It is a relatively straightforward process to become sponsor, but this shouldn't take the duties lightly. There are quite onerous obligations that you've got to keep up to date. So, I mean, for starting with, you've got to offer a role of a particular salary level. Now, as I say, it's reduced. So the standard skilled worker salary requirement threshold is 25,600. For these types of roles, it's 20,480. So, you know, a significant difference, may still be too high in lots of cross roles and different bits. And, you know, talking about market rates for salaries is a different conversation outside of today. But there's that reduced annual salary, or £10.10 per hour, which is much more achievable or closer to where some of these roles might already be paid in any event. So that helps. Now, the slight drawback on this is that the expansion of this existing visa to these type of roles has been announced as an interim measure. So it's going to be in place for an initial period of 12 months, subject to review. Now, that doesn't mean that if somebody applies under that, or an employer sponsors somebody under that, that it's revoked after 12 months. That's not the case. If somebody comes in under that visa, they're accepted, they've got permission to stay for 5 years, they can stay for 5 years, unless obviously there's a change or an issue with the sponsor license or their particular visa. It just means that this particular window of expansion, if I can call it that way, is looking likely to only be in maybe for 12 months. Unless it's reviewed and extended. So it's almost sort of the UK Visas and Immigration and the government sort of testing this. Is this going to ease or be a method of which we can have a migrant workforce that supports the health and care sector at this point in time? You know, what they're going to review it on, how they're going to assess it, obviously, I don't have a clue. But I think it's important to not miss out on this opportunity. And if this is something that employers and businesses are interested in, don't wait, because it may not be here if you wait and don't take advantage of it. You know, if it is something that's interesting to you and you think it would work for your business, then, you know, obviously get in touch and we can talk through in different bits, but actually don't wait until seeing what other people have done or deal with everything else first, because actually this opportunity may not be here if there isn't the uptake in it and doing it. So there are, as I say, you know, caveats to it. There are positives and negatives. It may work for some businesses, it may not work for them. You know, becoming a sponsor license, as I say, the application itself is relatively straightforward. You have to fill in all the forms, submit it online, pay the fee, etc., and go through. Then you have to sort of assign certificate of sponsorships to individuals, and then they apply for their visa. You know, it's a process, but you know, the systems are much improved. You know, you can do this all online. You know, they're taking of biometric data. You know, yes, it is a changeable position in different bits, but you know, in terms of jumping through the hoops and doing it, you know, if you engage with that process, it's something that can be done relatively quickly. The only thing I would say and would recommend that employers keep in mind is that there are strict sponsor license duties. So it's almost like as an employer, you're a sponsor license, you become a badge holder. And that seems a sort of a strange explanation or way of looking at it, but there are very strict requirements for being that badge holder. You have to have, very strict record keeping requirements. There has to be designated special roles within your organization. You can't share passwords and login details. There are certain nuances where if something is explained to somebody in a certain way, that then falls foul of the immigration rules. So you have to have your eyes open going into this. You have to have the systems and framework operationally in place to not only get it, but to not lose it. And that obviously the ramifications for the business are quite severe, but if the employer loses their sponsor license, the individual's visa is revoked and they have to leave. So, it's worth getting the administrative systems in place to make sure that you can do it. But it can be a really positive solution for businesses. And outside healthcare, looking back slightly and stepping back slightly, other businesses are looking at the skilled worker route as being a great resource for attracting, retaining talent, ensuring a flow of migrant workers, and benefiting from different skill sets and experiences. So this isn't something that alone impacts the healthcare sector, but I do think this expansion is not something necessarily to be sniffed at, and I think it can really help some businesses plug a gap in workforce.
Well, absolutely, and I feel slightly sort of but with sort of and it's not just adults, but adult social care crisis, Brexit, and COVID. We seem to be working our way through the alphabet of problems, don't we? I think
I've not thought about it that way. That's brilliant.
And you're sort of thinking, well, if we've learned nothing, is how quickly things can change.
Yeah,
positive and negative. And the point being that if it is law, you have to abide by it. It is not it's not an option. If the law says, you have to do it, or face the consequences. And so as you rightly said, there's huge sort of legislative changes we've sort of had to grapple with and see, and deadlines, and getting it right, and getting it right quickly, and grabbing opportunities when they present themselves. I think that is absolutely going to be crucial to sort of this success, and whatever your organization. And I think, again, going back to this idea that us all being human is like, we've all got personal lives. So whilst we might be sitting here talking about our day jobs, we may have or any of our sort of colleagues and clients may have things going on that they've got aging parents, they may have children, they may have siblings, they may have all sorts of things going on where they need this workforce. And it's that knock-on effect, isn't it? And I think I'm quite interested again to see if this sort of change in the way we're working is going to mean that it's going to be better for people to be able to provide those informal responsibilities, or how much reliance is there going to be on the formal structure.
And it's fascinating, because I think a lot of the informal care, if I can phrase it that way, not paid for caregivers that might be family or friends, the informal network, I think they were there before, but we might not necessarily have known, because they either weren't in work, or they were doing something different, or there were some organizations and measures that have been fantastically supporting these individuals for years, but I don't think it was necessarily known about maybe in the wider society about how much the impact and the amount of people that was then, and there were the very stats that came through, and I forgive me, I don't have the figures to hand, but it was terrifying, the amount of workers that were leaving the workforce overall, not just health and social care sector, but all sectors, to become carers. Was huge during pandemic and different bits, and it sort of really forced home the need for a variety in the workforce to be able to support those increasing pressures and demands. We've got an aging population, we've got tightening of care restrictions and how we're able to facilitate and support those people in life. We've got, as you say, it can be at any point in time, and with the multi-generational aspect, you might have somebody that's a middle manager that's quite senior and helping to run a business that has children that may need support, that has elderly parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents still that may need support. I just think you can identify anyone that actually falls within this, because it impacts all of us at any point in time. And if we're all seeking to work or work in this care provision sector, there's a lot of change that has happened and continues to need to change, not just pandemics and Brexit and all the rest that the world throws at us, but we've got retention and staffing issues are a present issue in most sectors, particularly health and social care. That's not going to go away, unfortunately. We've got increasing resourcing issues, salary pressures. I mean, we've got the energy price crisis. We've got, predictions of potential huge wage inflation this year, which, individually people might think, Grace, that's fantastic. But in order to meet rising living costs, okay, not so fantastic, because you've got to spend that money that comes in. But also businesses, where's that money going to come from? Because if you're going to have to suddenly give a massive pay rise to staff this year to reflect or counterbalance inflation and different bits, and to not lose staff, well, where is that money going to come from? And particularly in health and social care, where things are much more sort of council-led or government invested, or different bits where it comes through, there's just not that agility that can happen that maybe in slightly wider corporate sectors it can be. I mean, businesses, it's a rock and a hard place. You need to pay staff to keep them, otherwise they'll go. But there isn't a money tree. We've established that. Where's that money going to come from? And I think things like furlough and the innovation and the schemes that came out of that were fantastic, and they did preserve so many jobs. But we're going to be dealing with the ramifications of paying for furlough for a significant period of time. And I don't think that there will be such, whilst we've had that scheme, I don't think that it will necessarily be so quick to implement other schemes unless we're in such dire, constraints again, which obviously hopefully we're not. So there are some changes, there are flexibility, but I don't think there's, working from home is this great panacea that, is necessarily, hailed to be. Yes, it can work really, really well, but that isn't flexible working in and of itself. It is a form of flexible working, but actually, do we need more, hours changes and shifts and flexibility in how people work and how people operate and when they work, not just where they're working and what roles they go for. I mean, those that are carers, they've got very little rights as carers in the employment sphere. And, I would hope that there's an increasing discussion between businesses and supporting those. And there are organisations out there that say that they are pro-carer employers and things like that. So if it is something that people are interested in, absolutely resources out there, and you can find businesses that may be better suited for you and your responsibilities. But flexible working is on the table and it's here to stay, but that doesn't necessarily just mean that, as I say, working from home, or that, 4-day working weeks without reduction in pay. There's been a lot about that in the news and so on. I think there's going to be ongoing discussions and more dynamic solutions needed for everybody to make sure this works going forward, not just how we've been fighting fires during the pandemic.
And that's going to be such a challenge, isn't it, for both employers and employees? How do we all get that balance right? How do we get that balance right so we can recruit and retain and employ and grow and build and
it comes back to that bit I said at the beginning about building in resilience. Change is here. We've had change and it's been awful, but there's going to be ongoing change that may be awful and may be positive, and it's all about how we deal with that. And I think never are we seeing change happening so quickly. That curve of the graph is going up, be that inflation, be that pandemic crisis, etc. But you're also seeing a workforce, millennials and generation XY, etc, whatever code we're on now, that are demanding. It was International Women's Day this week, and it was a demand for not just lip service treatment on the day. It was to recognise and implement those as measures that were going through. And there were young people knocking on their employers' doors saying, well, what are you doing about this? And there isn't just, it seems like quite a shift. It's previously it may have been, I need a job, I'll take a job, thank you, I am grateful. Gross oversimplification, but very much, to well, what do I want out of my career, and where am I going to work, and what organisation reflects my values? So how do you support and seek to overcome the gender pay gap, the disability gap, the different bits, and how are you supporting the environment? What measures are you taking to ensure you're a green provider or a green corporation and business that's running? So I think there's just so much to think about, which maybe necessarily wasn't always on the table for businesses, and they're going to have to juggle all of this with ongoing changes that are implemented and brought in upon them. So it's about it's not necessarily getting it right all the time, although obviously that would be ideal, but that's just not how it works. But it's having open communication systems, being willing to listen to staff and being able to talk to staff, goes both ways here. Dealing with the sea change, the rough and the smooth as they come through, be that an individual issue, a workforce issue, or a pandemic issue, or changing in law, different bits that come through, and building in flexibility and nuances that can potentially mean that you can adapt and change as you may need to, and sometimes overnight, to reflect something. And I think those people that are able, and businesses and sectors and industries that are able to do that, will still be here in future and will carve how the employment landscape it looks in future. Whereas, as we've already seen, those that can't adapt or adjust will not survive, will not go through, will not change, and so on. So, I mean, it's incredibly exciting. A sort of nerdy or technical view of doing it. We've never seen so much change happen so fast. But then, we've got some things that have been slower to come to the table. I mean, there was a recognition. I mean, you and I years ago were talking about the introduction of there will be 5 days unpaid carers leave offered, and it's just been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back on the legislative agenda, and I totally understand that. But it wasn't even mentioned in the employment bill that's looking to do that. Wasn't even mentioned in the last Queen's speech coming through. So when is this coming? And it is fighting fires in different bits, but it just, there's a lot on the table here, and I think there's going to be a lot that continues to be on the table. And it's about how you engage with that on your workforce and the pressures that are coming on you, and it will pay dividends to do that now and continue to monitor and review that, than sort of sticking your head in the sand and not listening maybe as much or as often as may be needed.
And obviously, I mean, fascinating sort of listening to you talking about all this, and there is so much to get right, and it's so easy to get it wrong, isn't it? And so, yes, whilst lawyers can of course do crisis management, get in early, have a chat.
Yeah. We're not terrifying. It's not all about the cost and different bits. Actually, it's about thinking openly at a point in time, and employers can do a lot of this themselves. There's so much out there and resources, not just from lawyers and HR professionals and different bits, but there's just resources and sharing ideas, and it's about vulnerability and engaging in a dynamic leadership. I don't know is sometimes the right answer, and it's what should be said, but it's about having a conversation and opening that door to those that can help you. So I think, get help from wherever you think you can get it early on. And of course, as always, we are more than able and willing to speak to anybody that wants to discuss, vaccinations, COVID restrictions, issues, difficulties, general employment, you name it. Obviously, we're here and happy to help.
Veritable Mary Poppins with your carpet bag.
Well, I like to think that employment is one of the most broader areas of law. It impacts on so much, and we've got so much to it, but it's pretty wide. It's pretty wide. That's what I love about it, though. When the phone rings, you never know what the query is going to be. And as you and I may have chuckled about in the past, that there are some interesting ones that come through. But that's what keeps the day job interesting. That's why I'm very passionate about it.
Exactly. Well, Cecily, it's been absolutely brilliant. I mean, thank you so much.
No problem.
Fascinating. I mean, we could talk all day, and
we could. we shouldn't.
But there's so much in there, and there's so much to learn, and then to continue to learn. And I think we all have. I think it is about, for me, it's about adapting. It's about understanding that if we have to keep moving and adapting, because this is going on regardless.
Yes, it's not going to stop if you don't want to listen to it. You'll be swept up in it. So be on the front foot, very much so. Yeah, fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. That's been
thank you for having me.
And we'll obviously make sure we've got contact details for your good self, and we can go from there.
Perfect. Thanks ever so much.
Very much.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.